microeconomics, and we are talking about oligopolies today in Chapter 17. All right, like I said, only a few sellers now. Only a few really big players. Whenever you hear of the top 3 or the top 4, the top accounting firms, for example, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young, KPMG, and Deloitte, they've got really, really big companies that they're really interdependent because there's so few of them, because they're so big, they are interdependent in terms of whatever one does in terms of production and pricing, it does affect the other one. With monopolistic competition and perfect competition, there are no barriers to entry. We can have lots and lots of entrants, lots and lots of competitors, and there are so many of them that, you're just going to have to, it really doesn't affect one in terms of what the other one does. There are just so many of them, but here they're interdependent. That's going to make more sense in a little bit. And because of this interdependence, this mutual interdependence, we talk about game theory with this market structure. Now, game theory is a relatively new branch in economics, and it just deals with strategic thinking. So how are we going to behave? And this can be applicable to games, it can be applicable to war, it can be applicable to business like we're talking about. But what's the best way that we can act, the best choice that we can make, no matter what our opponent is doing? Or maybe we know what our opponent is going to do. We can make some guesses about what they're going to do. If they're going to price high, price low, if they're going to produce a lot or produce a few things. What's the best thing that we can do? So we're making our decision making based on what the other person might do. And that's what game theory deals with. And we're only talking about an oligopoly because there's so few of them that they're so interdependent. Because we have the top 3, top 4, there's a small group of sellers, and there's always this tension between cooperating and doing what's best for themselves. Okay, well, why would they want to cooperate? Do you remember yesterday when we were buying and selling? All right, so here again, and I told Gregory, you're the only seller. I probably should have told you beforehand. But after a couple minutes, he said, oh, so that means I should just wait it out and then charge a higher price, right? And if we had a bunch of buyers in here, and I put several of you together, maybe 3 or 4 people together, and let you all know ahead of time, y'all are the only sellers, y'all are the biggest players here, you own 90% of the market share, they could get together and have the same thinking that Gregory did. If they all cooperated and say, let's agree to not sell this truck for less than $11, then what choice does everyone else have? Yes, they have choices of 4 people they could buy from, but they've all agreed to set the price high, to act like a monopolist. So in terms of profits, that would be best for the oligopolists, but for consumers, it's obviously bad. Now, why is there this tension between cooperation and self-interest? Well, one of those 4 might say, well, I could sell a little bit more. Law of demand, there's that negative relationship between the price of the product and the quantity demanded. I could sell a little bit more than these 3 people over here if I just lower the price a little bit. Maybe I can sell to $10.50 to a couple more people. That way I can get a couple more of my products sold. So if they all do that, though, then it becomes more and more like a competitive market, and we'll see lower prices and lower profits for them. But there's always that tension there. Should we cooperate or do what's maybe lower the price and sell a little bit more? There are powerful incentives not to cooperate because they're each, that self-interest there. If I just sell a little bit more, they're always thinking about that profit. All right, so a few it doesn't necessarily mean 3 or 4. It could mean 2. You know, by definition, we've got at least 2 for an oligopoly. So here's an example with a duopoly. I think Jack and Jill was the example in the book, and they've got a well, and they are producing gallons of water. And your author says to assume that it doesn't cost them anything to produce these gallons of water. They can just go and get it anytime they want to. So here's some data here with the demand schedule for water and revenue. So actually, before we go back to Jack and Jill, your author's just pointing out, by comparison, a perfectly competitive firm, that's the most socially efficient market structure that we've talked about here. For monopolists, they raise that price, they go all the way up to the demand curve, so that's higher than marginal cost. They're going to produce less than what the efficient quantity is. So, just in comparison, for a duopoly, if those 2 producers, Jack and Jill in this case, can collude. Okay, collusion, we're talking about their behavior. If they can get together, make an agreement, illegal by the way in this country, and form a cartel, that means that they have agreed, this is what we're going to produce, this is our level of production, this is what we're going to sell at. They can act as a monopoly. So, if Jack and Jill both looked at that demand schedule and figured out what is the most efficient, or not efficient, what's the most profit maximizing, what's the profit maximizing quantity? All right, well, let's say that it was 100 gallons of water. I can't remember the data, but let's just pretend it was 100 gallons of water. They could split it both ways. You make 50, I'll make 50. Let's make an agreement. We can maximize profit that way. So that would be an example of collusion and maximizing profits. And in this case, they are together acting as a monopoly. Although, maybe there are more customers. And maybe Jack or Jill says, well, if I could just produce 51 gallons of water, I could sell a little bit more, maybe at a lower price. So this tension between cooperation and acting in their own self-interest is always going to be there. When 2 players do act in their own self-interest and maybe cheat on each other, we get to an outcome that's called a Nash equilibrium. And I'll show you an example in a few slides, but a Nash equilibrium is when we come to a suboptimal outcome. It's not the best in terms of profits for the firms. It might result in lower prices for consumers, but in terms of the producers, it's not the best outcome. Have y'all seen the movie A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe? Okay, he played John Nash, and that's who this Nash equilibrium is named after. So he did a lot of work in game theory. A couple of definitions. Collusion is the behavior, so an explicit agreement on prices and levels of production. A cartel is just what we call the group of firms. So the players who are actually colluding. So this is the verb, this is the noun. And John Nash's work was famous because he said when you have 2 players that are, if you just analyze their behavior on an individual level and they're acting in their own self-interest, it makes sense for that person to act that way. But together, collectively, they both end up at an equilibrium, at an outcome that's not best for them. They're not maximizing profit, and we get stuck there. So that's what he meant with the Nash equilibrium. Even though they were both acting in their own self-interest, and it was the best strategy for both. Again, we'll look at an example in a second. Because we always have this tension between cooperation and self-interest, another factor that we have to think about is the size of the oligopoly. So if there are two of them, if it's just Jack and Jill, maybe they can agree on the level of production and maybe trust each other to enforce their agreement. But once we start having 3 or 4 people or more, then it gets harder and harder. Because you've got to make sure that everybody's following the rules. You've got to make sure that everybody doesn't cheat on you, even though there's an incentive to. Because if you can get everybody to cooperate, then you could maximize profit, and all of y'all could act as a monopoly. But we see in real life, cartels don't stay intact for long. They might have good ideas to maximize profit at first, but there's always this, they're always torn between these two effects. The output effect, should I sell more units? And if they do, they're going to have to lower the price in order to do that. So more and more coordination problems as we have more and more entrants into the oligopolistic market. So the number of sellers gets larger and larger, and it's going to start looking more and more competitive. How many of you have flown from Chicago to New York? We'll find that route. Do you remember which airline you used?
Probably American or United.
Okay. Up until 2006, it was only United or American that flew that leg. In 2006, JetBlue did that flight as well, and we saw prices go down by 65% as compared to when it was just United and American. So as we have more and more sellers, we've got lower prices. It looks more competitive. Okay, so an example that economists use to illustrate this tension between cooperation and self-interest and cheating is called the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, and we'll talk about a dominant strategy in just a second. It's easier to talk about when we have an example. So this is a great example of showing how cooperation is difficult to maintain. So I need 2 volunteers. Marcus. And who else? I'm just going to ask you a couple questions. Okay, Trey. So Trey, go out that door. Marcus, you go out this door. And don't interact with each other. I'll call you out in a second and then ask them a questions. All right. They have both robbed a bank, and we're pretending that we've separated them in different jail cells. We're going to ask them to come in, and if they want to confess that their friend was involved, or if they want to stay silent. So confessing would be like cheating for them, right? It'd be better for us as the police department, but it's going to be like cheating for them because they're going to have their friend in jail, and then they're going to get a deal and they can avoid some jail time. If they say, no, none of us were involved, then that would be like cooperating in their minds. So, prisoners are people who commit crimes. They go into it, they say, we're going to never tell on each other, we're in this for life. But, police, I'm not very mean, but police can be pretty mean when they interrogate. So, let's see how they react. Come on in, to Marcus. And don't sit down yet. I just need to let you know that, we know that somehow you were involved with Trey in a robbery, and we have enough evidence to convict you of a weapons charge. We know that you are involved somehow. So, we can lock you up for a year just based on that evidence. But if you tell us that Trey was involved somehow, if you rat him out, I'll give you immunity. I'll give you 0 years, and he's going to have to serve the 20-year sentence. But, if you don't say anything, if you don't tell me that he was involved, then we're going to need to put both of you in jail. So, what is your choice? Tell me that Trey was involved. Okay, you've got to pretend like this is 24. I'm Jack Power. I'm being really good. So, is Trey involved? Just tell me and you'll have immunity. He was not? All right. I'll let you go back outside. Thank you. Okay. Trey, do you know that you were involved with DeMarcus at a robbery? So we know that you were involved somehow. I would have to put you away for a year on a weapons charge. But if you confess and tell me that DeMarcus was involved, put the blame on him, and we'll let you go scot-free. So 0 years in jail versus 1 year. If you say he wasn't involved.
How long he's in jail for?
1 year.
No. DeMarcus.
I will put him in jail for 20.
20?
Yeah.
It's kind of like him, I think. A lot of it,
Okay.
White guys always rat people out. You're going down, bud.
Let's come over here. I'm going to come back to your dominant strategy. Thank you, by the way. Let me show y'all.
Good for you.
And you see this all the time with reality TV shows. They'll pit people against each other. But okay, so for DeMarcus and Trey, usually, if I was mean enough, and I've had students who have parents, their dad's the police chief, and they say their dad can make grown men cry, use the bathroom in the chair as they're being really mean and talking to them and getting them to confess. Usually they do confess and tell on each other. So DeMarcus did not rat you out, but Trey did rat out DeMarcus. So Bonnie and Clyde, we'll use these two since they're in the book's example. Okay.
There was no hesitation.
So Clyde, just like DeMarcus, had the option of confessing, and that means ratting out your partner. Okay, this is one choice right here, and then Clyde had the choice to remain silent and say, nope, not involved. Nobody, my partner was not involved. So those were the two options. So Bonnie had two options also, right? Rat out the partner or remain silent. Now, if both of them remained silent, I said I had enough evidence to convict them of a weapons charge, and they would both get 1 year, right? But let's take a look here. We're going to only look, let me do this. And I'm not sure what that's going to do to our video, but it's all right. This audio will be there. Okay, let's pretend that we're going to start here with Clyde. Okay, we're going to start with confess. Okay, Clyde's payoffs, this is called a payoff matrix. They're in pink and they're on the left side. at this row right here at the top. What is the best option for Bonnie if Clyde confesses? So if Clyde's going to confess, we're on this row. Now we're going to look at Bonnie's payoffs. 8 years in prison or 20 years in prison? Which one's better? 8 years in prison. So if Clyde confesses, Bonnie's better off confessing because we compared these two numbers and we want less time in jail. If Clyde remains silent, and that's Clyde's choice, so now we're going to look at Bonnie's payoffs. What should Bonnie do? Confess or remain silent? Confess, because no jail versus 1 year in jail. This is better. You see what happened? No matter if Clyde confesses or remains silent, Bonnie is better off confessing. That's called a dominant strategy. If you have a strategy, because I've got the underlines in the same column here, if you have a dominant strategy, that means that you have a decision that you're going to be better off in no matter what your opponent does. That was on the previous slide. We'll go back to that in a second. All right, now let's do it the other way. Now we're going to look at column by column. Okay, in this column, what does this mean? Bonnie has confessed. So now we're going to see what should Clyde do. So if Bonnie confesses, should Clyde confess or remain silent?
Confess.
Confess. 8 years in prison is better than 20 years in prison. If Bonnie remains silent, and that's what the second column is talking about, what should Clyde do?
Confess.
Confess or remain silent?
Confess.
Confess. Because 0 years in jail is better than 1 year in jail. So, does Clyde have a dominant strategy? No matter what Bonnie does, what should Clyde do? Confess. Here are my two underlines for Clyde. They're both in the confess row. So they both have the dominant strategy to confess. And it makes sense when we did it, person by person, right? When we did the comparisons of the payoffs. But what happens when they both confess? We end up here, and they both go to jail for 8 years. Is that the best outcome that they could have had?
No.
What's the best outcome?
Remain silent.
Down here, if they hadn't had told on each other. Okay, this would have been the best outcome, but we end up here. And this is Nash equilibrium. This quadrant right here. And that's why John Nash was so, anyways, for finding that. When you've got these two players and they do what's best in their own self-interest, they end up at a suboptimal outcome. They could have been here, right? So, it's very, very interesting in terms of strategy and what your opponent's going to do. Criminals intend on being in this quadrant, right? But then when you, in real life, they always end up here, and that's why cartels break up too. So, let me come back over here. Dominant strategy is the best strategy for a player in a game, regardless of what the other player does, just like we figured out. And before we move on, I have to show you all this. This is from Dilbert. Y'all are going to understand now that we've just talked about the prisoner's dilemma.
Tell us what happened and we'll recommend a light sentence.
Nice try. But I happen to understand a little thing called the prisoner's dilemma.
Is that so?
You have no physical evidence of a crime, so you can only convict us if one of us rats out the others. And since we're all aware of that fact, no one will rat out anyone, and we'll be free in a matter of minutes.
should all his victims. Oh, hi, Gilbert. Alice. He has always been evil. I felt it. But I never knew how evil until he would not stop plunging that fork into Todd's body. I stopped counting at 100. Oh, God.
Hello, Gilbert.
A shock. May I have that ice cream sandwich you promised me now?
Okay, so maybe if I had more of an incentive for DeMarcus, we might have told him there. But anyway, thank y'all for volunteering. In real life, we see that cartels there's always an incentive to cheat on each other. And so, cooperation isn't sustained for a long time, and we can just expect that. We just see that in real life. So, the game that they play in terms of should we restrict production, that's what we've agreed on, or should I produce a little bit more, you can think of that as the cooperation versus the cheating, in the same way that we had with our prisoners. Like I said, cartels are not legal here in America, but outside of our country, you all may have heard of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and I can never remember who's in there. It's like 12 or 13. It's always changing because of them not being able to agree on production levels. So someone has the incentive to cheat, and so they'll kick that person out, and then another country will come in, or not that person, that country. So in 1960, here are these countries in the Middle East that agreed on the production of crude oil. And you can see that by 1973, there were more of them, and they tried to restrict supply. As you all know, as supply decreases or shifts to the left, then the price of the product is going to increase. And we've mentioned this before, gasoline in our cars, we have to get to work and school. So in the short run, at least, our demand for that product is somewhat inelastic. The problem is, there's that incentive to just produce a little bit more than what we agreed on, just for a little bit more profit and to cheat. And so they began arguing about production levels. They were successful for a long time, over 10 years, but then in the mid-'80s they were, having to kick out some countries because they wouldn't stick with their agreement. And so we also saw a decrease in price. Now, in the late 2000s, we did see an increase in the price of gasoline again, but that wasn't because of the supply side, it was because of the demand side. China's economy definitely grew a lot. Incomes increased, and a lot of people who rode bikes before were now able to buy cars, and so their demand increased. A couple of other examples. Again, with Jack and Jill and their production of gallons of water, they would both be best off in terms of profit by doing what? Okay, both agreeing total we're making 60 gallons. You make 30, I make 30. They can maximize profit that way. But if there's that incentive to cheat and they produce a little bit more than what they agreed on, you can see as a whole, they're going to be worse off than if they had agreed. And this, what do we call this again? We get to the suboptimal outcome?
Dominant.
Nash equilibrium, when both parties used their dominant strategy. They were both doing what's best in their own self-interest compared to what their opponent was doing or their other player was doing. But this would have been best. And some other examples that we can apply the prisoner's dilemma problem to is arms races, or if we're talking about, we had that big debate about guns on campus, you all might remember last year. So if we allow guns on campus, do our campus police need bigger guns? And then, where does it stop? Or if a country doesn't listen to us and they have these nuclear weapons, well, what do we do? Do we arm ourselves more and then have an arms race, or do we not arm ourselves and then we're vulnerable to a possible attack in the other, for our other choice? And you can imagine the dominant strategy, the best thing to do is to not be vulnerable and to be able to fight back, right? And so when both countries have a bunch of nuclear weapons, then that's not the best solution. The best solution is if both of the countries didn't have all of these nuclear weapons. So this would be best, but if you just think about it in terms of the dominant strategy, what's best for this country if another country that's not listening to us keeps, building nuclear weapons? The dominant strategy is going to be for both countries to arm themselves. And then we'll end up at a Nash equilibrium here. I do want to point out there's not always a dominant strategy. It just depends. You just have to go through row by row, column by column, like I did. So sometimes there is a dominant strategy, sometimes there's not. If game theory interests you, I have a couple more books that you could look at. This is by The Evolution of Cooperation by Robert Axelrod, and this was really interesting. They had different computer programmers submit different programs to elicit the most amount of cooperation. So how do you get, this was a computer game, how do you get people in real life to cooperate with you and work with you as a team? And they found that in real life, I'll talk about this more to the next slide, but in real life we see more cooperation if there are repeated plays. So if you know that there's a future and you're going to have to see that person and work with that person in the future, there's more of an incentive to cooperate. So that is a factor. If everybody's agreed on the penalties, if someone does cheat on the agreement, then we can elicit more cooperation that way. And if these penalties are actually enforced. But the best strategy for cooperation that they found with these computer programs is kind of a funny name, tit for tat. That means if your opponent cooperates with you, you cooperate back. If they cheat on you, you punish them right away. And then as soon as they cooperate again, then you cooperate again. So whatever your opponent does, you do back. And that is what they found to be the most effective strategy for eliciting cooperation. All right. In terms of public policy towards oligopolies. Okay, in our country, explicit price fixing is illegal. They're not allowed to collude in this country and form a cartel. But can companies kind of watch what other companies are doing? Watch their prices, look up their prices on their websites. Maybe American. You remember the days when you didn't have to pay baggage for when you're flying, you didn't have to pay for your baggage. Well, they might kind of watch. If American starts charging baggage fees, does everybody flock to all the other airlines, or are those customers still there? Are they still having sales? Because if that's working for them and customers are willing to pay $25 for a bag, then maybe we can start doing it too. There's no explicit agreement, but they can just kind of watch what their competitors are doing. Okay, and we've talked about these antitrust laws before. They can be used to stop a merger or maybe break up a company afterwards. And it can also be used to prevent, these laws also give the government power to prevent oligopolists from colluding and working together and acting as if they were a monopolist. Here's a transcript, part of a transcript of an illegal phone call in the early 80s, and I think Robert, president of American Airlines, so he was trying to say, hey, let's explicitly agree on these airfares, and he was sued by the Justice Department. So he, the Braniff Airways president, turned over the tape to the Justice Department because he knew that this was wrong. So
Who turned it in?
he did.
Oh,
Howard. So our Justice Department tries to prevent things like this, to try to promote competition and help consumers, but sometimes it's not so easy to tell if they're really colluding or if they're just having a discussion. Sometimes businesses that appear, or business practices that appear to reduce competition might actually have legitimate purposes. And so there's controversies over how much the government should get involved if they're trying to stop these kinds of things, stop collusion. How many of y'all have ever gone into maybe a big store, Best Buy, you're looking around at all the different models because you want to see one in person, you want to see a laptop or whatever in person, and then you're asking around, you're asking the salespeople all your questions and what their recommendations are, and then you go home and you buy it online or somewhere else. Can you get it cheaper? Okay, I think probably most of us have done that. Is that fair to a big retailer like Best Buy for us to take advantage of the knowledge of their salespeople, to take advantage of the displays in their big showroom?
No, it's not fair.
Well, yeah, it is. You give them first choice, though. That's the thing. You're still giving them the first opportunity.
Well, and that's the debate here. Should we make sure that Amazon sells it for the same exact price as Best Buy so that we don't take advantage of those salespeople and get it cheaper somewhere else?
And then who's to say that the salesman knows more about the product than online research? Go ahead.
Well, y'all can see what they're saying here, right? So it might see.
I mean, because the thing is going to Best Buy is not without cost. It costs you money to get there with gasoline, and it costs you time. So in a sense, and then versus shopping on online, which has a lower cost to you. So in a sense, you're incurring more cost by doing that yourself. So it's not like it's a win-lose situation.
Yeah. So there's, should the government get involved and try to control something like that? There's just the debate. Another thing that we've got to debate over is predatory pricing. So, we've talked about barriers to entry. There are going to be significant barriers to entry in this market structure. If there are only a few big players, for whatever reason, they've gotten big for a reason, and they have captured most of the market share, so it's going to be hard for a new entrant to come in. So, if a new entrant does come in, and let's say those big players all of a sudden agree to cut prices and make it really, really hard for that new entrant to be profitable because now they're trying to compete on these temporary low prices from the big players, and they're doing that on purpose to drive that new entrant out. Should the government step in and stop that from happening? Well, skeptics or economists would say, even if big players did that, that's not sustainable. So, should we get involved or not? How do you know and differentiate between just regular competition and then which business practices are actually predatory?
There's only one company that the government controls the prices, so they're not competitive. That's the Postal Service.
because that's, yeah, they're regulating them.
It's a government entity.
A tying contract, we've mentioned this before. So how do you make sure that somebody, if you're producing printers, if you say that you can only use our ink, Hewlett-Packard ink in a Hewlett-Packard printer, if you can only use Kodak film in a Kodak camera, you can expand market power that way, and that's called a tying contract, where you say that you have to use that for each. But, you know, should the government come in and say that companies cannot do that? And there's the argument there, well, are customers actually going to buy those two products if they didn't think that it was a good product, first of all? And, you know, how, I mean, what's the role of the government? When should we come in and step in and stop these kinds of things, or when are they actually, you know, legitimate business practices? The rest of the slides deal with a case study on Microsoft. I know I had a group talk about Microsoft before, and they had a tying contract where they tied in the browser to the operating system, Microsoft, Internet Explorer. And you all mentioned, let me skip over to this slide. You all mentioned that our government stepped in and said that they would need to be broken up into different companies. In fact, they had that decision appealed, so they actually didn't have to get broken up into different companies, one for the applications, one for the operating system. So that part they didn't have to do, but they did have to share some of their code. And this was, you know, over 10 years ago, and now you'll see more and more people using Apple, Linux, and other browsers too. It's not just, people aren't just using Microsoft as much as it was, you know, back then when this was in the courts. Okay, that is the end of chapter 17.